The summer air hung heavy over Washington, D.C., thick with humidity and thicker still with dread. Beneath the marble facades of democracy's heart, a shadow was spreading. On street corners, whispers carried tales of vans, unmarked, predatory, sliding through the night, their doors swallowing protesters whole. These weren't rumors spun by fear. They were truths etched into the faces of mothers, clutching photos of their missing sons, of students who dared to raise signs and voices against a regime that seemed to grow bolder by the day. At the center of this storm stood a president, unnamed yet omnipresent, his every word a blade slicing at the Constitution's fragile threads. Freedom of speech, the right to assemble, these weren't just ideals, they were lifelines, and they were fraying under his grip. In a packed community hall on the city's edge, the air buzzed with defiance. The room, lit by flickering fluorescents, smelled of sweat and resolve. Men and women, young and old, crammed shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on a makeshift stage where a lone figure stood. She was no politician, no celebrity, just a woman with a voice that trembled not with fear, but with fury. Her name was Clara, a schoolteacher whose soft-spoken lessons on civics had turned into battle cries. "This isn't just about power," she said, her words cutting through the crowd's murmurs. "It's about who we are." They're rounding up innocents, our neighbors, our friends, tossing them into cages without names. That's not America. That's a dictatorship wearing our flag like a mask. The crowd roared, a wave of sound that rattled the windows. Clara's hands gripped the podium, knuckles white, as she recounted the stories piling up like kindling. A young poet grabbed mid-verse. A father vanished after a rally, their fates unknown. Each tale was a spark, and the room was tinder. "We're not just fighting for them," she said, her voice rising. "We're fighting for the soul of this nation. He thinks he can silence us, break us, erase us, but we're still here and we're not going anywhere." Her words weren't just a promise. They were a vow, sealed in the collective heartbeat of a people refusing to bow. Outside, the city pulsed with unease. Police sirens wailed in the distance, their red and blue lights painting the night in warnings. Posters plastered on lampposts bore slogans of resistance, already peeling under the weight of time and tear gas. Yet Clara's voice lingered, echoing in the minds of those who'd heard her. She spoke of a president who saw the Constitution as an obstacle, not a covenant. His agents, faceless and relentless, moved like specters through the streets, their vans a symbol of a democracy under siege. But Clara wasn't alone. Across the country, others were rising. Mechanics in Ohio, nurses in Georgia, students in California, each carrying the same fire, the same refusal to let their freedoms be stolen. This wasn't just a moment. It was the opening salvo in a war for America's future. The hall emptied, but the energy didn't dissipate. It spilled into the streets, into homes, into hearts. Clara stepped into the night, her breath visible in the cool air, and looked toward the Capitol's distant glow. She knew the fight was just beginning, and she knew what it would cost. But she also knew this: no unmarked van, no detention cell, no tyrant cloaked in power could extinguish the will of a people determined to stand tall. Clara walked home through streets that felt less like her city and more like a battlefield. The Capitol dome loomed in the distance, its white stone gleaming under floodlights, a beacon of promises made long ago. Her mind churned with the weight of her words from the hall, but now they tangled with memories of her classroom, dog-eared textbooks, chalk-dusted fingers, and the wide-eyed kids she'd taught about a nation born from rebellion. The Founding Fathers, she'd told them, weren't just names in a book. They were men who'd bled for a dream, a country where no single soul could hold the reins of power unchecked. Now that dream was under siege, and Clara felt its pulse in her veins. She stopped at a small park, where an old oak stood sentinel over a plaque commemorating the revolution. The words carved into it spoke of liberty, of sacrifice, of a war fought against a king who'd treated freedom as a privilege to be revoked. Clara's fingers traced the inscription, her thoughts drifting to the Constitution, that sacred blueprint hammered out in Philadelphia's sweltering summer. It wasn't just paper. It was a shield, dividing power among Congress, the president, and the courts to keep tyranny at bay. She could almost hear her own voice, years ago, explaining it to her students. Legislative makes the laws, executive enforces them, judicial interprets them. No one branch can swallow the others. That's how we stay free. But freedom was slipping. The president, his name unspoken, as if saying it gave him power, wanted to be king. Clara saw it in the newsreels, heard it in the rumors. Executive orders that ignored Congress, court rulings dismissed with sneers, agencies gutted without a vote. He wasn't just bending the rules, he was burning the rulebook. She thought of her students, now scattered across the country, some at the protests, some in those vans. They deserved better than a nation sliding backward into the shadows of autocracy. The next morning, Clara joined a march to the National Archives, where the Constitution lay enshrined behind glass. Thousands gathered, their signs a forest of defiance. No king here, power to the people. 1776 lives. The crowd was a cross-section of America. Farmers in denim, lawyers in loosened ties, retirees with canes, teenagers with megaphones. A historian, gray-haired and fierce, took the megaphone, her voice carrying over the throng. "They fought a war to stop one man from ruling us," she said, pointing toward the archives. "They wrote that document so we'd never kneel again. This president thinks he's above it. He's wrong." Clara felt the crowd's roar in her chest, a primal surge of unity. The historian's words painted a vivid picture. Muskets flashing at Lexington, quills scratching in candlelit rooms. A nation forged to keep power in check. But the president's shadow loomed larger now, his ambition a direct challenge to that legacy. He didn't just want control, he wanted worship, a throne built on the ashes of checks and balances. Clara clutched a pocket constitution, its pages worn from years of teaching, and whispered to herself, "Not on our watch." As the marchers spilled toward the Capitol, Clara's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about her, or the missing, or the vans. It was about the idea of America itself. The founders had known power's seductive pull, had designed a system to cage it. Now that system was being tested, and Clara, like so many others, was ready to defend it. The fight wasn't just in the streets. It was in the heart of every citizen who remembered why this nation was born. She glanced back at the archives, its stone facade unyielding, and felt a spark of hope. The Constitution wasn't just history. It was a call to arms. The march from the National Archives had left Clara's throat raw from chanting, her feet aching, but her spirit unbowed. As the crowd dispersed near the Capitol's shadow, she lingered, watching the city settle into an uneasy dusk. Neon signs flickered to life, and newsstands brimmed with headlines screaming of chaos. But it was the silence beneath those headlines that chilled her most. The quiet strangulation of the press, the lifeblood of truth. The president's war on the media wasn't fought with guns, but with lawsuits and intimidation, each move a calculated stab at the heart of a free society. Clara's thoughts drifted to her father, a small-town reporter who'd taught her that a pen could be mightier than a sword. Now, that pen was being wrested from hands across the nation. She stopped at a cafe, its windows plastered with flyers demanding justice. Inside, a television blared, tuned to a cable news panel, dissecting the latest assault on the Fourth Estate. The president had sued ABC, CBS, and the Des Moines Register, claiming their critiques were slander. His FCC was sniffing around NPR and PBS, threatening their funding like a bully shaking down a kid for lunch money. Clara's jaw tightened as she sipped her coffee, overhearing a customer mutter, "He loves the cameras when they flatter him. But the second they call him out, he cries foul." The irony was galling. A man who'd hurled vulgar insults at rivals, whose Twitter rants were a daily spectacle, couldn't stomach a critical word. The cafe buzzed with debate, voices rising over clinking mugs. A young journalist, her press badge dangling from a lanyard, spoke up at a nearby table. "It's not just about hurt feelings," she said, her eyes fierce. "It's control. If he can scare the networks into silence, who's left to tell the truth?" Clara leaned closer, catching the woman's name, Lila, a freelancer who dodged tear gas to cover the protests. Lila recounted how newsrooms were buckling, editors second-guessing stories to avoid legal fees. "He's not just suing," she said. "He's suffocating us. And if we go quiet, so does democracy." Clara left the cafe, her mind racing. The president's hypocrisy was a grotesque mirror to the nation's soul. He thrived on adoration, basking in fawning coverage, yet recoiled at scrutiny like a child scalded by hot water. She thought of her father again, his late nights typing exposés on corrupt mayors, his pride in a job that held power to account. "If you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen," he'd say. Clara muttered it now, her breath clouding in the evening chill, a mantra for a president who'd rather burn down the kitchen than face its flames. Walking past a newsstand, she saw a fresh headline: "President slams media as enemy of the people." The words hit like a punch. This wasn't just about one man's ego. It was an assault on the truth itself, on the reporters risking everything to shine light into dark corners. Clara's thoughts turned to Lila, to the countless others like her, their laptops and notepads a fragile bulwark against tyranny. The president could sue, he could threaten, but he couldn't erase the stubborn courage of those who refused to bow. As she headed home, the city's pulse seemed to sync with her own, a defiant rhythm, a vow to keep speaking, keep writing, keep fighting. The streets grew quieter, but Clara's resolve burned brighter. The media wasn't just a target, it was a symbol of what America could lose. She passed a mural of a quill piercing a crown, its colors vivid against the brick. It reminded her of the hall, the march, the Constitution clutched in her pocket. This fight was woven into the nation's fabric, and she'd be damned if she let it unravel. The president might want silence, but Clara, Lila, and millions more were ready to shout. The mural of the quill and crown lingered in Clara's mind as she wound through Washington's streets, the city's pulse now a restless undercurrent beneath her steps. The air carried a faint tang of smoke, a reminder of recent protests, but it was the invisible weight of power shifting that pressed heavier on her chest. The president's war wasn't confined to newsrooms. It stretched to the Capitol's hallowed halls, where the people's voice was meant to reign. Clara's thoughts churned with Lila's words about control, but now they turned to Congress, the heartbeat of legislation, the embodiment of checks and balances, now under siege by a man who saw laws as suggestions, not mandates. Morning broke gray and heavy, the sky mirroring the mood as Clara joined a growing crowd outside the Capitol. The steps, usually a stage for pomp and ceremony, were now a battleground of ideals. Protesters clutched signs scrawled with fury. "Congress, not king. Fund what we voted for." At the center stood a congresswoman, her voice sharp despite the wind's bite. "He's gutting agencies we created," she declared, her finger jabbing toward the White House's distant spire. "Withholding funds we approved, slapping tariffs he has no right to impose. This isn't leadership, it's lawlessness." Clara's heart thudded as the congresswoman's words sank in. She thought of her students, how she'd taught them that Congress was the people's shield, crafting laws to protect and provide. But the president was dismantling that shield, with surgical precision. Agencies born to safeguard the environment, health, education. Gone or crippled, erased by executive fiat without a single vote. Funds for schools, hospitals, roads, frozen, held hostage to his whims. Tariffs slapped on allies and rivals alike sparked economic tremors, their legality as shaky as the ground beneath the protesters' feet. Among the crowd was Marcus, a union organizer Clara recognized from the community hall. His weathered hands gripped a megaphone now, his voice gravelly, but unbroken. "I've seen factories close because of those tariffs," he roared. "Families losing homes because funds for aid never came. This ain't just politics. It's theft from the American people." Clara nodded, her throat tight. Marcus's story wasn't singular. It was a chorus echoing across the nation. Farmers bankrupted by trade wars, teachers scraping by as school budgets withered, all while the president claimed victory on screens nationwide. The Capitol loomed behind them, its dome a silent witness to the erosion within. Clara imagined the empty committee rooms, the stalled bills, the lawmakers intimidated into silence or complicity. The president wasn't just overreaching, he was rewriting the rules of power, treating Congress like a servant rather than an equal. She clutched her pocket constitution, its edges frayed, but its words unyielding. "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress." Those words were a contract, and he was tearing it to shreds. As the rally swelled, a line of police formed, their shields glinting under overcast skies. Clara's pulse quickened, but she stood firm, shoulder to shoulder with Marcus and others. They weren't just defending budgets or agencies, they were defending the very structure of democracy, the delicate balance that kept one man from becoming monarch. The Congresswoman's voice rose again, defiant. "We voted for progress, not paralysis. We won't let him steal our power." The crowd erupted, a tidal wave of sound that drowned out the sirens beginning to wail. Clara's gaze drifted to the Capitol's columns, each one a testament to endurance. This fight wasn't new. It was as old as the nation itself, a tug of war between freedom and control. But standing there, amid the chants and the chill, she felt the weight of history urging her forward. The president could ignore laws, starve programs, slap tariffs, but he couldn't break a people united. As the rally pressed closer to the Capitol's steps, Clara whispered to Marcus, "He's picking a fight he can't win." Marcus's eyes gleamed. "Damn right." The rally's fervor clung to Clara like smoke as she and Marcus parted ways, the Capitol's silhouette fading behind a curtain of dusk. The chants of the crowd still echoed in her ears, but a new unease coiled in her gut. The president's reach wasn't just strangling Congress. It was clawing at the judiciary and beyond, sinking into the very institutions that anchored America's soul. As she walked past a courthouse, its limestone facade stern under streetlights, Clara felt a chill that wasn't from the evening air. The law, once a bedrock, was now a battleground, and the fight was growing uglier by the day. Inside a nearby diner, the clatter of plates mingled with heated talk. Clara slid into a booth, catching snippets of conversation from a group of law clerks huddled over coffee. "He's going after judges now," one said, her voice low but sharp. "Any ruling he doesn't like, he calls for impeachment. It's a vendetta, not justice." Clara's fingers tightened around her mug as she listened. The president wasn't content with bending rules. He was targeting the men and women who upheld them, branding dissent as betrayal. Names of judges, once obscure, now flashed across headlines, their lives upended for daring to defy him. The clerk's words painted a grim picture. A federal judge in Ohio, threatened after blocking an executive order. A circuit court panel smeared for upholding voting rights. But it wasn't just judges. The president's wrath extended to law firms that had crossed him, their offices buried under lawsuits and audits until some buckled, withdrawing from cases to save themselves. Clara's heart sank at the thought. Firms caving, not out of cowardice but survival. Their resources drained by a man who wielded power like a bludgeon. "It's intimidation," another clerk muttered. "He wants the whole system to kneel." Clara's thoughts drifted to the universities, those bastions of truth where ideas were supposed to flourish, not wither. She'd heard whispers of deans and professors treading carefully, their research grants held hostage by a White House that demanded loyalty over inquiry. A friend, a history professor at Georgetown, had told her of colleagues softening critiques to avoid scrutiny, their pursuit of knowledge warped by fear. Clara's jaw clenched. Universities weren't just buildings. They were the nation's conscience, and the president was trying to muzzle them, trading federal dollars for silence. She left the diner, the city's pulse now a jagged rhythm. Passing a law library, its windows glowing with late-night studiers, Clara felt a surge of defiance. The president could threaten judges, bully firms, pressure campuses, but he couldn't erase the stubborn streak in those who believed in justice. She thought of the clerks, their tired eyes burning with resolve, of professors slipping truths into lectures despite the risks, of judges standing firm, their gavels a quiet rebellion. They were the thin line holding back chaos, and Clara knew she was part of that line too. The night air carried distant sirens, a reminder of the vans still prowling, the protests still flaring. Clara's hand brushed the pocket constitution she carried, its weight a grounding force. The judiciary, the universities, the law firms, they weren't just institutions. They were the scaffolding of a free nation, and the president was hacking at their foundations. But scaffolding could be rebuilt, reinforced. She thought of Marcus's grit, Lila's courage, the congresswoman's fire. This wasn't just a fight for laws or grants. It was for the right to question, to judge, to learn, to resist. As she turned toward home, Clara passed a protest sign nailed to a lamppost. Truth over tyranny. It fluttered in the breeze, fragile but unyielding, like the people it spoke for. The president's attacks were spreading, but so was the resistance, a network of voices refusing to break. Clara's steps quickened, her mind alight with purpose. The courthouse, the library, the classrooms. They weren't just targets. They were battlements, and she'd defend them with every breath. The night might be dark, but America's spirit was a flame no bully could snuff out. The protest sign's defiant flutter stayed with Clara as she made her way home, the words "truth over tyranny," a beacon in the gathering dark. But as she crossed a bridge over the Potomac, its waters reflecting the city's restless glow, her thoughts turned outward, beyond America's borders. The president's shadow wasn't just choking courts and campuses. It was stretching across oceans, twisting alliances, and staining the nation's moral compass. Clara's heart, already heavy with domestic battles, now ached for a world watching America falter, its beacon of democracy flickering under a man who seemed to admire dictators more than defenders of freedom. At home, Clara sank into her worn armchair, the television casting a harsh light across her small living room. A news anchor's voice cut through the static, reporting the president's latest foreign policy gambit, a speech blaming Ukraine for Russia's invasion, painting Putin as a misunderstood strongman. Clara's blood boiled. She'd followed the war closely, moved by images of Ukrainian families huddled in bomb shelters, their courage a mirror to her own fight. Yet here was the president, rewriting history to cozy up to a tyrant, dismissing the blood and bravery of a nation under siege. "Ukraine didn't start that war," she muttered, her voice trembling with fury. "Putin did." She thought of her cousin, a diplomat who'd served in Kyiv, his letters filled with stories of resilience, farmers turned fighters, children singing anthems amid rubble. America, he'd written, was supposed to lead the world in lifting up democracies, not shaking hands with autocrats. But the president's words were a betrayal, aligning him with Moscow's iron fist while turning his back on those battling for freedom. Clara's mind flashed to history lessons she'd taught. America's stand against oppression, from World War II to the Cold War. That legacy felt like a fading echo now, drowned out by a man who saw strength in cruelty, not compassion. The next day, Clara joined a vigil outside the State Department, where candles flickered against a backdrop of flags from nations fighting their own battles for liberty. A Ukrainian refugee, her scarf embroidered with sunflowers, spoke to the crowd, her accent thick, but her resolve unyielding. "We look to America for hope," she said, her eyes scanning the faces before her. "But your leader praises the man who bombs our homes. Tell me, where is the America that stands with us?" Clara's throat tightened, the woman's question a knife to her conscience. She glanced at the others, veterans, activists, students, each grappling with the same shame, the same determination to reclaim their nation's soul. The vigil grew into a march, weaving through streets lined with embassies, their windows reflecting the crowd's glow. Clara walked beside a retired colonel, his medals pinned to a faded jacket. "This isn't just about Ukraine," he told her, his voice steady but laced with grief. "It's about every democracy watching us. If we let him cozy up to dictators, we're telling the world freedom's negotiable." His words hit Clara like a gust of wind, sharpening her resolve. The president's foreign policy wasn't just misguided. It was a surrender of values, a signal that America's spine had softened. As they passed the Russian embassy, its gates locked tight, Clara's thoughts turned to the broader fight. Supporting democracies wasn't just rhetoric. It was a debt owed to history, to the soldiers who died for liberty, to the founders who dreamed of a nation that led by example. The president's flirtation with Putin was a slap to that legacy, a choice to kneel rather than stand. But Clara saw defiance in the vigil's candles, in the refugee's plea, in the colonel's unwavering gaze. America's heart still beat for freedom. She felt it in the march's rhythm, in the voices rising against the night. The Potomac glimmered as Clara headed home, its currents a reminder of time's relentless flow. The president might twist truths and court tyrants, but he couldn't silence the millions who believed in a better way. Clara's fight wasn't just for her streets or her courts. It was for a world desperate for America to lead again. She clutched her pocket constitution, its pages a quiet promise. This nation was built to stand tall, and she'd make damn sure it did. The Potomac's shimmer faded as Clara trudged home from the vigil, her shoes scuffing against pavement worn by countless footsteps. The night's chill seeped into her bones, but it was the weight of the world's woes that pressed harder. The Ukrainian refugee's plea still rang in her ears, a call to reclaim America's moral compass. Yet, as Clara unlocked her door, the television's glow pulled her toward another crisis. One not of distant bombs, but of a closer, more tangled tragedy. The president's shadow stretched to the Middle East, where his policies fueled a fire that threatened to consume millions. Clara's heart, already scarred by battles at home, braced for a new wound. She sank onto her couch, the news anchor's voice a grim drumbeat. Images of Gaza flickered across the screen, rubble where homes once stood, children's shoes buried in ash, faces etched with grief no human should bear. The anchor spoke of numbers: 50,000 dead, over 100,000 wounded, an entire infrastructure reduced to dust. Clara's breath caught. She'd taught her students about war's cost, but these weren't lessons. They were lives, each one a story snuffed out. Israel, the anchor said, had a right to defend itself against terror, and Clara nodded faintly. Self-defense was a truth she held firm. But this was something else, a campaign that seemed to grind a whole people into the earth. Then came the president's voice, clipped and resolute, demanding $8 billion more for Israel's war machine. Clara's hands clenched into fists. $8 billion. to rain more destruction, to widen the chasm of suffering. The anchor cut to analysts, their words a storm of debate, but one phrase sliced through. The president's plan to expel 2.2 million Gazans, to clear the land for his billionaire cronies' playground. Clara's vision blurred with rage. A playground? The word was obscene, a mockery of the blood-soaked ground, the shattered schools, the hospitals turned to graves. This wasn't policy. It was plunder, cloaked in power, dressed up as progress. Morning found Clara at a synagogue downtown, where a coalition of faiths had gathered to mourn and resist. The room hummed with voices, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, united in a shared horror. A rabbi, her eyes red from sleepless nights, spoke first. "We stand with Israel's right to exist, to be safe," she said, her voice steady but soft. "But we cannot stand by while innocence is crushed, while homes are erased, while a people are pushed to oblivion." Clara felt the words like a tide, pulling her into a deeper resolve. Beside her stood Amal, a Palestinian-American nurse whose family had fled Gaza years ago. "My cousins are still there," Amal whispered, her voice breaking. "They're not numbers. They're my blood." The gathering spilled into the streets, a procession toward the White House, their banners heavy with pleas. No more blood money. Gaza is not a game. Clara marched beside Amal, their steps a quiet vow. The president's plan wasn't just reckless. It was a moral abyss, a scheme to profit from pain while the world watched. She thought of her classroom, where she'd hung a map of the world, pointing out places where justice faltered. Now, her own nation was writing a new chapter in that story, and it sickened her. "We'll stop this," she told Amal, her voice fierce. "We have to." Amal's eyes met hers, a spark of hope amid the grief. "My people deserve to live, Clara, not to be pawns for his friends." The march swelled, voices rising in a chant that shook the air. Not one more dollar, not one more life. Clara's thoughts raced to the vigils, the rallies, the Constitution in her pocket. This fight wasn't just for Gaza. It was for the soul of America, for the principle that no leader could trade human lives for profit. The White House loomed ahead, its gates cold and unyielding, but Clara's spirit burned hotter. The president might dream of empires built on suffering, but she and millions more would tear that dream apart. As the crowd pressed forward, Clara felt the weight of history again, not just America's, but humanity's. The cries of Gaza echoed the cries of every people pushed to the edge, and she'd be damned if she let her country add to that chorus. Her hand brushed Amal's, a silent pact. This was their stand, their line in the sand, and they'd hold it with everything they had. The White House gates stood like silent sentinels as Clara and Amal stepped back from the march, their voices hoarse from chanting, their hands still linked in solidarity. The crowd's roar lingered, a defiant hymn against the president's heartless ambitions in Gaza. But as the protesters dispersed into Washington's twilight, Clara's mind turned inward, to the soil beneath their feet. America's wounds weren't just etched in foreign wars or shuttered courtrooms. They were carved into the lives of its own people, where the glittering wealth of a few cast long shadows over the many. The fight for justice, she realized, wasn't only about stopping a tyrant's schemes abroad. It was about building a home where every soul could thrive. Clara's apartment felt smaller that night, its walls crowded with memories of her students' faces. Kids from Rust Belt towns, from city corners, from places where dreams often withered under the weight of want. She flicked on a lamp, its glow catching a stack of letters from former pupils, now scattered across the country. Their words a patchwork of struggle. A nurse working double shifts to afford rent. A mechanic laid off when tariffs killed his factory. A mother skipping meals to feed her kids. The president's America, Clara thought, was a land of kings and serfs, where billionaires soared while workers sank, their labor fueling fortunes they'd never touch. She met Marcus the next morning at a community center, its paint peeling, but its spirit fierce. The room buzzed with organizers, their tables piled with flyers and petitions. Marcus, his union cap tilted back, was rallying a group of steelworkers, his voice a gravelly anchor. "The richest folks in this country are getting richer every damn day," he said, his fist tapping the table. "Meanwhile, we're scraping by, losing homes, losing hope. That's not an economy. That's a rigged game." Clara nodded, her heart sinking with his rhythm. She saw it everywhere. Skyrocketing profits for tycoons, stagnant wages for the rest, a nation splitting at its seams. A woman stood up, her apron smudged from a diner shift. "My girl wants to be a doctor," she said, her voice trembling but proud. "But college costs more than I'll make in a decade. How's that fair when his friends buy islands for fun?" The room murmured agreement, a chorus of shared pain. Clara's thoughts flashed to the president's cronies, the ones eyeing Gaza's ruins for profit, the ones hoarding wealth while America's backbone bent. This wasn't just greed, it was theft, a betrayal of the promise that hard work meant a fair shot. Clara took the floor, her teacher's poise sharpened by fire. "We're not just fighting him," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "We're fighting for us, for an economy that lifts every hand, not just the ones holding gold. He wants oligarchy, rule by the rich. We want democracy, rule by the people." The words poured out, fueled by the vigils, the marches, the faces of Amal, Leela, Marcus. She spoke of jobs that paid enough to live, schools that didn't bankrupt dreams, healthcare that didn't choose wallets over lives. The crowd leaned in, their nods a quiet vow to reclaim what was theirs. Outside, the city hummed with purpose. Protests at banks, rallies at factories, voices rising from coast to coast. Clara walked with Marcus to a park where families gathered, their picnic blankets a patchwork of hope. Kids chased fireflies as parents swapped stories of resilience. A co-op starting, a union striking, a community garden feeding hundreds. "This is what we're building," Marcus said, his gaze soft but fierce. "Not his world, theirs." Clara smiled, her pocket constitution a steady weight against her hip. The president's America was a fortress for the elite, but theirs was a nation for all, and they'd tear down every wall to prove it. The fight wasn't over, not for Gaza, not for truth, not for fairness. But standing there, Clara felt the tide turning, a current of millions pulling toward justice. The president might cling to power, but power belonged to the people, and they were waking up. She looked at the kids, their laughter a promise of tomorrow, and knew this was why she fought, not just to stop a tyrant, but to forge a world where every dream had room to grow.